Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to this new episode of What's New in the iOS Community, my live newsletter where I don't just send you an email with links to some articles, I actually discover them, read them, and comment them live with you. So for this new episode, I have 5 new articles ready for you. You have all the links in the description if you want to check them out on your own. And I can tell you I'm pretty excited about this new episode because I haven't done one of these live in a few months now. And since I don't want to read the articles beforehand, this way there is still like the element of surprise, which makes it more interesting both for me and for you who are watching. Basically, there have been a few articles where I saw them. I was like, wow, that sounds interesting. Let's put it aside for the next time I do my live. And I actually haven't done it until now. So there are a few articles that I'm really curious to get to discover. I think that's more than enough for the intro. I see a few people are starting to arrive in the chat. Welcome everyone. We are about to get started, and we're gonna get started with a first article right here that's called Double Protocol Conformance. And it's not that old, so it's from the end of April, something like 3 weeks ago at the time where I'm doing this live. Let's see what this is about. So sometimes fixing issues in your code base can have side effects you never thought of. You assume everything that could go wrong or that could go wrong was considered, but then once merged, weird things happen. I exactly had this last week. I was fixing a bug about double protocol conformance, which in the end led to the application behaving weirdly and not recognizing data that was saved beforehand. In this small article, I want to share what I learned from this. So first, what is double protocol conformance? Double protocol conformance occurs when a type is declaring conformance to a protocol multiple times. And we can, of course, understand it declaring conformance to the same protocol multiple times. For example, a type which conforms to Codable is conforming to the same protocol again in an extension. So this code we have right here. So it's interesting. I see on the video feed. Oh no, okay. I was like, why is the code like white when it is black for me? But no, there is a white code and then there is a black code. Okay, everything's all right. So we have a struct item that conforms to Codable, then an extension to item that also makes it conform to Codable, and it would produce an error, redundant conformance of item to protocol decodable. If we declare the conformance to a protocol in the same target multiple times as seen above, Xcode will throw an error and will not build the target. So everything is happening inside the same target, meaning in the same unit of code, so in the same app, in the same module, that kind of thing. Now the tricky part. So far so good. When accidentally declaring the same protocol conformance in the same target, Xcode has our back and will stop compiling our project. The interesting part comes when you declare the same conformance in a different target. Then things are not that obvious any longer. Let's use the example from above. We declare an item type in our target A, which conforms to Codable, and does not implement custom decoding or encoding and rather uses the auto-generated Codable conformance by the Swift compiler. So this is the code that is mentioned. So we are in target A, we have the file item.swift with the struct that is declared and that conforms to Codable. Secondly, we declare an extension on item in target B where target A is imported. Now, custom methods for encoding and decoding are implemented, in this example with different coding key names. Okay, so now we're inside target B, we are importing target A, we have an extension of item that conforms to Codable, so we are declaring the conformance to Codable for a second time, and in this second conformance, we are overriding the default coding keys and also encoding and decoding functions. Xcode is not reporting an error any longer. Instead, it reports a warning which tells us the type we are extending already conforms to the Codable protocol. So here it says conformance of item to protocol decodable was already stated in the types module target A, so it's no longer an error, it's a warning instead. In regular cases, this is still quite obvious for one to see when opening Xcode. But sometimes warnings are overseen, and since the code compiles fine, one might think everything is good. This can be misleading, with the following issue shows us. So now we're getting to the bug. Last week, I found a warning of double protocol conformance in our codebase and wanted to fix it by moving the custom encoding and decoding methods to target A. This was easy, I thought. So we are in target A, we have the struct, and then the extension just below. But of course, the extension is going to generate a double conformance error, a double protocol conformance. Wrong thought. The tricky thing now is that the app where this bug was fixed was already in production and had saved data to disk, encoded with the old implementation, meaning with the double protocol conformance issue. I was under the assumption that when double protocol conformance is occurring, the second overridden implementation is going to be used. I was wrong. Actually, what is going to be used is the first conformance to the protocol. This led to the following issue. If we assume we have our example from the beginning, before the fix, the data was saved using the auto-generated codable methods, leading to a JSON representation like the following. Okay, so we have ID and names, so the name of the properties in the JSON match the name of the properties in the struct, which is the default behavior of Codable. After the fix, the code was expecting a JSON representation with the following format, so with product_ID, product_name, which is the consequence of the overridden coding keys we have right here. We can already see the keys are different. And since I didn't implement any kind of migration logic, the decoding process failed and the application was not able to read the saved data any longer. In the end, I simply removed the custom decoding and encoding logic since it was anyway not used by the application and fully relied on the auto-generated implementation in target A. If I would have needed the custom implementation, it would have been necessary to write a migration logic to fix the old keys and from then on use the new keys from the custom implementation. So what was happening is that basically before this conformance to Codable with the overriding of the default behavior in target B would build, but it would be completely ignored. And in a way, the warning could be better because it could say like this will not be used, like maybe not in all cases, but at least in the case we're seeing, this was not be used. So it was basically like dead code, dead and misleading code. But to be honest, like dead code is often misleading. And so the extreme, we can even bring the issue to an extreme, which would have made it even harder to debug. Thanks a lot to Rob, who raised awareness of this. Think of having 3 targets now. Target A declares the item type and does not conform to Codable. Target B depends on target A and extends conformance to Codable with a custom implementation. Target C also depends on target A, so target C is independent from target B, but not on, so yeah, target C depends on target A but not on target B, so what I was saying, and extends conformance to Codable with a custom implementation as well. So target A declares the type, and both target B and C declare a conformance to Codable, each with their own different custom implementation. Now Xcode is not even bringing up warnings again. Nothing shows us that we made a mistake in setting up our protocol conformance. And if we would now import all of these targets in another one, it depends on which order the frameworks are imported, and the behavior would change without us knowing upfront. Let's have a look at the following snippet. So we have some file that is inside our executable, so either like a top-level library or an iOS app, a macOS app, that kind of thing. And we import in order target A, B, and C, create an item, encode it, and encode it. We encode, okay, and then get it into a string. This would lead to the following JSON representation. So we would get, basically it's the logic inside target B that would be used. However, if we switch the order in which target C and B and C are imported, so that C is imported before B, then it would be the custom implementation of Codable inside target C that would be used. This fact makes it even harder to detect issues, especially in a heavily modularized codebase where multiple teams are working on the codebase, where it could be hard to keep track of which protocols are getting retroactively added to public types. Conclusion: I hope with this small story I was able to show you the tricky parts of having double protocol conformance in multiple targets. Always pay attention to warnings when you confirm a type 2 protocol, and remember that only the first conformance is going to be used. Any subsequent conformances will be ignored by the compiler. If you are working with multiple developers in a codebase, make sure you set up rules for your protocol conformances to avoid the extreme case we took a look at. This is crucial to avoid surprises. Let me know what you think about this post, and if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to reach out to me. See you next time. Definitely a great article because I had no idea that this behavior could happen. I kind of knew that you couldn't confirm a type to a protocol twice, but that when you are like across targets, the behavior of the code would change depending on the order of your import. I had no idea about it, and I'm really glad I know about it because it's really like if one day you have an issue that is similar, that actually if you have this issue, maybe you won't like recognize it like straight away, but you will be okay. What's happening, and as you try to troubleshoot, knowing that this kind of thing can happen can definitely like help you like go in the correct direction. So great job to the author of the article. So this is on a blog called T-Byte. I might have discovered actually this blog recently because I think it's the first article I read from this blog, but seems like a great blog, so definitely go check it out. And like with every article we're going to cover in this live, the link is in the description. Before I move on to the next article, remember that if you are watching live, you have the chat at your disposal to share any question or remark, whatever it is that you want to say or that you would like me to react to. Please share it in the chat. This is what will make this live even more valuable for people that will watch the replay. For the next article, we move to another blog, a blog that I am familiar with called Use Your Loaf, and it's talking about Swift reflection. And I really wanted to cover this article because I've done some content around reflection, so around using mirrors in Swift. The one that jumps to mind is a video where I was showing how you could access private properties using reflection in Swift. So let's see if like this is what will be discussed, but I'm curious to see what will be the content. It's from the 24th of April, so also quite a recent article, and it's supposed to be a 3-minute read, even though with me reading out loud and hopefully some comment and discussion, it should take a little bit more. So let's get started. I've never made such use of advanced Swift features like reflection. Here's a couple of situations where I found it useful. First, checking properties are valid. In my first example, I had a large struct with 18 properties, most of which were strings. The user can change the properties in a form, and I want to check each property was valid before allowing the user to save the form. So we have our struct, all of the properties, a boolean locked, we'll see what it does, and an updated at date. So really you can imagine in an app you have like a form and you can edit the content of the form, and when you validate, if all the properties have valid values, then it would also update the update at date. For the struct to be valid, each of the string properties has to be non-blank. I'm using a small extension on string to test for blank strings. So extension on string, public var is blank, and all satisfy $0 is white space. So if all the characters in the string are a white space, then the string is blank. Kind of nice. I'm curious to see like if you put like only like a carrier return, I guess. I'm not sure if it works, but also in a form, I'm not sure that you can like put a carrier return. It's an interesting question. But let's continue on the topic of this article. So testing each property in turn is a lot of typing. So yeah, it's kind of like if you were to conform to equatable by hand. So you take all the property and you say, okay, I want to make sure that name1 is not blank, and name2 is not blank, and name3 is not blank, and name4 is not blank, and name5 is not blank, and we stopped at 5, and there are 18 in total. My properties don't have such uniform names, so it's easy for me to miss one. It's also easy to forget to update it if I add a new property to the struct. Using Swift Reflection now, we can get access to the stored properties of a type, like my record struct, by using the mirror API. So we create a record, then a mirror reflecting the record, and the children property of the mirror gives us access to the structure of the reflected instance. We can use that to iterate over the label and value of each property. So we have this children property on the mirror, and if we iterate over all the child in this collection, we can get the label of the child and the value of the child, and you can see the label is the name of the property, and the value is the actual value stored in the property. You can see the label is optional because there are times where you could not have a label. Think of things like an associated value for the case of an enum that doesn't have that it's not mandatory for this kind. I'm going to redo it. It's not mandatory for an associated value to a case of an enum to have a name. So like you can sometimes not have a label for a property. I mean, not for a property. A property must have a name, but property-like ways to store data don't always make having a name mandatory. I guess it will be the same thing for tuples also. So note that the label is optional as it's not guaranteed to be available at runtime. Oh, so it could be also because information is like destroyed at compile time if you build with optimization, maybe. That's interesting. Could be the case or could be not. Like I have no idea what's the conclusion here. We can use this mirror API to rewrite my isValid check. So inside isValid, create the mirror, then iterate over the children property by doing compact map. I'm saying, okay, first we only, so this compact map basically it only keeps the properties that are of type string. So it's you can see it as like a filter and a cast to remove, more like a cast and then a filter to remove the nil values. And then all satisfy with, so that was already what was already there. Actually, I would have even, oh yes, no, I was about to say like you can use the extension, but yes, inside is blank, it uses all satisfy, and here it also uses all satisfy on the result of the compact map, which makes total sense. And if you've never used all satisfy, it's a method in the Swift standard library. You pass it a closure, and it will return true. So you pass it a closure that takes an element of the collection as an argument, and that returns a boolean, and all satisfy will return true if the closure returns true for all elements. As soon as one element returns false, then all satisfy returns false. And so in logic, it's the for all quantifier. It's like if you had written a property quantified with for all or for any given. I'm not sure how you say it in English actually, but the a that is upside down. So the compact map tries to cast each value to a string, discarding any failure. So basically what I started explaining. I can then test the array of strings are all non-blank. This version removes the risk of me missing a property and doesn't need updating if I add or remove properties in the future. So it is indeed a great way to use mirrors in Swift. Whenever you use like this kind of implicit behavior, it's always a bit, of a double-edged sword, because imagine like you add a new property that is a string but that shouldn't be tested, then it will be included. So it's interesting, but you want to use it like with caution. Actually, for that kind of stuff, I really like the solution that we have in this article. But if I were to do the same thing, I would use a tool like Sorcery that lets you generate the isValid, that lets you like write a template that will generate the code of the isValid, and Sorcery supports annotation, so you could annotate with a special comment the properties that must be validated, and I guess it would be a safer way to do it. Or you could do it even like maybe use a property wrapper. Yes, you could use a property wrapper, that would be great. Like you create a property wrapper at validated, for instance, and then inside here the compact map, instead of casting to just a string, you would cast to a validated of string, because the property wrapper would be generic. That would be an even better way to do it. Unit testing now. I'm a little wary of using the Mirror API for production code, but it does have uses for unit testing. I have another method on my record structure that normalizes each of the string properties by trimming any leading or trailing white space. The Mirror API saves us some error-prone typing when asserting that we correctly trimmed each string property. My struct has many more properties than this example. So let's see, we have a test. So testing normalizing the string. So in the record, we can see that some leading or trailing white spaces have been purposefully added. Then the method normalize. And then it uses the mirror to iterate over all of the child that have a value of type string and make sure that they all equal XYZ. So they all have the same value inside with a different amount of leading and trailing white spaces. So this one is quite clever. This one is quite clever. Honestly, like now that I know it, if I can find a use case for it in my own projects, I think I will be very happy to use it. So what do you think? Have you found any other practical uses for the Mirror API? I can share one, which is to be able to access the value of private properties, which is also quite dangerous, but can be useful either if you are like typically like writing tests for that maybe use some third-party SDK and you want to test some inner workings of the third-party SDK. I wouldn't recommend necessarily like doing it, but it's possible, and you can also do things like just like like being able to iterate over all of the properties of type string. You could imagine like a protocol called plugin, and then like every property of type plugin on your app delegate, you iterate over it and you call a method like start. For instance, it can be also a nice way to have plugins that are like starting automatically. Once again, big double-edged sword, because you can also have implicit behavior that people are not aware of. So you want to be careful, but the Mirror API is, I feel, not as known as it should be, because it can be extremely useful. So that's why I wanted to cover this article that talked about it and that shared two very interesting use cases. So we've actually already covered like two articles, so we're going quite fast today. But the next article is going to be a bit more long, I think, a bit longer actually. So let me just move it a bit so that you can see it in the video. Okay, seems visible. Perfect. All right, so we are on the blog of Donny Valls, that I'm sure a lot of you probably know because he is very active in the iOS community. And this article, I wanted to cover it because, as you can see, it's in the category soft skills. So it's not about a technical topic per se, but it's about tips and tricks for exploring a new code base. And this one, I was really curious to discover it. So let's get started. As a developer, joining a new project or company is often a daunting and scary task. You have to get acquainted with not just a whole new team of people, but you also have to familiarize yourself with an entirely new code base that might use new naming conventions, follow patterns that you're not familiar with, or even uses tooling that you've never seen before. Something interesting to mention here is that Donny does a contracting job. So for him, discovering a new code base is much more common than, for instance, for me. Like I discovered a new code base when I switched jobs last year, but before that I had spent the same the 6 years before in the same company. So I guess I don't have the same experience switching code base regularly than Donny has. So it also will be very interesting for me to cover this article. So there are plenty of reasons to be overwhelmed when you're a new member of any engineering team, and there's no reason to feel bad about it. In the past 2 years, I've done a lot of contracting and consulting. Once again, just going ahead of the article, which means that I've had to explore and understand lots of code bases in short amounts of time. Sometimes even having to explore multiple code bases at once whenever I start to work for more than one client in a given week or two, which must be quite brutal, to be honest. I guess it's fair to say that I've had my fair share of confusion and feeling overwhelmed with new code bases. In this post, I like to provide you with some tips and tricks that I use to get myself comfortable with code bases of any size in a reasonable amount of time. So first, meet the team. While it might be tempting to get through your introductory calls as soon as possible so you can spend as much time as possible on navigating and exploring a new code base, I highly recommend letting the code wait for a little while. Meet the team first. Getting to know the people that wrote the code that you're working with can truly help to build a better understanding of the code base as a whole. Ask questions about team dynamics and ongoing projects, who's an expert on what. Building empathy around the code you'll be working with is a very valuable tool. Knowing which team members know most about specific features, part of the code base, tools that are used in a company, and so on, helps you figure out the right person to ask any questions you might have while you explore the code base. For example, when I joined Disney almost 6 years ago, I wasn't all that familiar with SwiftLint. I had heard about it, but I had no idea what it did exactly. In the codebase, I saw some comments that looked as follow. So SwiftLint, disable, next, cyclomatic complexity. Of course, I could paste this comment into Google and go down a rabbit hole on what's happening, and I'd probably have learned a lot about SwiftLint, but instead, I chose to figure out who knows most about SwiftLint within the team. Surely that person could help me learn a lot about what SwiftLint was used for and how it works. I asked my team lead, and luckily it was my team lead that actually knew lots and lots of things about SwiftLint, how it was set up, which linter rules were used, and so on. We had a good chat, and by the end of it, I knew exactly why we had SwiftLint at Disney Streaming, which rules we had disabled or enabled and why it was okay to disable certain rules sometimes. Google could have taught me that the comment you saw earlier disabled a specific linter rule to allow one exception to the rule. My coworker taught me not just what the command did, but also why it did that, and why that was okay, and when I should or shouldn't disable certain linter rules myself. So not only getting knowledge about how the tool works, but also how it has been used by the team, and that is much harder to find on Google because the inner context of your team is most of the time not available on Google. If you are very lucky, there could be like blog articles published by your team, but most of the time it won't be the case. So that's indeed a great example. Another example is a more recent one. One of my clients had a pretty large code base that has had many people working on it over the years. There's some Objective-C in there, lots of Swift, it has UIKit and SwiftUI, multiple architecture patterns, and much more. It's a proper legacy code base. Instead of figuring everything out on my own, I had conversations with lots of team members. Sometimes they were one-on-one conversations, but other times I met with 2 or 3 people at once. Through these conversations, I learned about various architectural patterns that existed in the codebase, which ones they considered to be good fits, and which ones they were looking to phase out. I learned why certain bits of code were still in Objective-C, and which parts of the Objective-C codebase should be refactored eventually. So once again, we can see that it's all about learning as much context as possible. I learned that certain team members had spent a lot of time working on specific features, patterns, and services within the app. They would tell me why certain decisions were made and which choices they were and weren't particularly happy with. So also getting all of the history of what happened. After meeting the team, I knew so much more about the project, the code base, the people working on the project, and how things move and evolve within the team. This was incredibly helpful information to have once I started to explore the code base. Through knowing the team, I knew so much more about the why of some bits of code. And I knew that some code wasn't worth exploring too much because it would be gone soon. On top of that, through knowing the team, I felt more emphatic about bits of code that I didn't like or didn't understand. I know who was likely to have worked on that code, so instead of getting frustrated about that bit of code, I knew who I could ask to learn more about the confusing section of code. Now it's going to talk about breaking things. In addition to meeting the team behind your new codebase, you'll want to start exploring the codebase itself sooner rather than later. One of the key things to figure out is how the project is set up, which code is responsible for what, or how does one thing impact the other. Hopefully, the codebase follows some well-established patterns that help you figure this out. Regardless, I find it useful to try and break things while I explore. By introducing flaws in the business logic for an app, by introducing flaws in the business logic of an app, by introducing flaws in the business logic for an app on purpose, you can learn a lot about the codebase. Sometimes it helps you uncover certain "this should never happen" crashes where a team member used a force and wrap or wrote a guardlet with a fatal error inside. And other times, things break in more subtle ways where the app doesn't quite work but no errors are shown. Or maybe the app is very good about handling errors and it indicates that something went wrong, not as expected, but the app or maybe the app is very good about handling errors and it indicates something went wrong or not as expected, but the app informs you about this. When you break the networking layer in your app, you might uncover some hints about how the app handles caching. By making small changes that most likely break the app, you can learn tons. It's a technique I often use just to see if there are any threads I should start unraveling to learn more and more about the cool details of a codebase. Of course, you don't want to go around and start poking at random things. Usually, when I start exploring, I'll choose one or two features that I want to focus on. This is exactly the focus of my next tip. So indeed, trying to break small things and see how the app is going to work can be a great way to first understand how the app works, but also get some kind of idea of how much the app is robust against errors, because it gives you an idea of how much you will need to be careful in writing your own code. If you see that errors become visible very easily, you will not need to be maybe that careful and you can rely on the app and the project itself to guide you towards fixing the errors. But if you see that errors go totally unnoticed and they are pulled under the rug by the code base by default, then you will know that you will need to be much more careful. And why not also try to start a refactoring effort to try and improve on this situation. So next tip is about focusing on a narrow scope. When you join a large enough code base, the idea of having all of that code in your head at some point sounds impossible. And honestly, it probably is. There's a good chance that most developers on the team for a large project will have one or two parts of the code base internalized. They know everything about it. For everything else, they roughly know which patterns the code should follow, because the whole team follows the same patterns. And they might have some sense of how that code interacts with other modules. Overall though, it's just not realistic for any team member to know all of the ins and outs of every module or feature in the code base. And even your own code, you tend to forget if it was very complex after a year, all the tiny details of your own code. So why would you be attempting to explore the entire code base all at once? If you're hired on a specific team, focus on the code that would be maintained by that team. Start exploring and understanding that code in as much detail as possible. Have team members show you how the code works and see if you can break some of the code. Sometimes there will be bug tickets or features that you can start looking at to give you a good starting point to begin learning more about the code base. If that's the case, you can use your tickets to help you determine your scope. If you're working on a bug, focus on understanding everything you can about the section of code that seems most likely to be the source of the bug. And as always, you'll want to be in touch with the team. Ask them if they can help you find something to focus on initially. When you have a bug ticket to work on, see if somebody on the team can help you kickstart your research, maybe they have some thoughts on where you can start looking first. And in an ideal world, leverage pair programming to double the speed at which you learn. And the idea of starting like with fixing a bug can be a great way to go inside a code base, because usually you're dealing with code that is already established. If the app is not that bad of a state, the bug should be something like maybe fairly like trivial, because I mean there are nasty bugs and easy bugs. Here we're talking about like easy bugs, but things like like a label is not going on two lines like it should, that kind of thing. They seem simple, but when you arrive on a new code base, they are actually like a great way to discover the code base. So like Donny is saying, I totally agree with what Donny said. And I would also say, if you are going to onboard someone new on your team, you might want beforehand to like find one or two easy tickets that they can work on to start discovering parts of the app, and then maybe give them work that focuses on a specific feature, because this way they will not like spread themselves too thin for the first week, the first weeks, or the first month. I see a few messages in the chat. So Dave, you're saying cool new video format, and congrats on recently reaching 10k YouTube subs. Thank you. I have an idea of a live for the 10k subs, which will be like let's watch and react to my first videos. But since I had already announced this live, I didn't do it this week, even though I reached the 10k this week. But it will happen like sometime in June or in July. We'll see, because there is also the WWDC, and I will prioritize like WWDC oriented content over just like watching my old videos. And glad to see that you're enjoying this new format. I actually did it like twice in January and February, I think, or like twice in February, and then left it a bit aside to focus on my SwiftUI training course. But now that the training course is over, I'm resuming it, and I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying it. And Florent, you're saying very interesting, especially to guarantee code consistency. So yeah, I agree that the tips shared here by Donny are really good tips. Next tip is about leveraging pair programming. So one tool that I usually find to be immensely underused is pair programming. In lots of places where I have worked, developers prefer to work alone. Headphones on, deep in the zone, questions should be initiated on Slack so you're disturbed as little as possible. Disable notifications if you have to. There's absolutely a time and place for deep focused work where you're not to be disturbed. However, there's an enormous benefit in pairing up with a teammate to explore topics and work on features, especially when you've just joined a team. It's super important to have access to your team members to help you navigate the company, team, and codebase. When you're pairing with a teammate during your exploration phase, you can take the wheel. You can start exploring the codebase, asking questions about what you're seeing as you go. Especially when you have something to work on, this can be extremely useful. Any question or thought you might have can immediately be bounced off your programming partner. Even if you're not the person taking the wheel, there's lots of benefit in seeing somebody else navigate the code and project you'll work on. Pay close attention to certain utilities or tools they use. If you see something you haven't seen before, ask about it. Maybe those Git commands your coworker uses are used by everybody on the team. Especially when there's debugging involved, it pays dividends to ask for a pairing session. Seeing somebody that's experienced with a codebase navigate and debug their code will teach you tons about relationships between certain objects, for example. Two people know more than one, and this is especially true while onboarding a new coworker. So next time a new person joins your team, offer them a couple of pair programming sessions. Or if you're the new joiner, see if there's somebody interested in spending some time with you while working through some problems and exploring the codebase. This is very insightful, and I can share that someone new joined our team at work, and one of my colleagues took time to do pair programming with that new person, and the feedback was that it was indeed very useful. And on my end, I've never done that to discover a code base. However, what I used to do when I started at my new job last year was like, if I was working on something So I was supposed to be working on something, so I was working on something. But if I was working on a specific feature with a specific goal, what I would do is like in the morning, I would kind of like explore potential solutions, write down my ideas, and then after lunch, do a quick meeting with a more experienced developer on the team to show what I had like seen, ask the question I could have, and tell the person in which direction I was planning to go. This way, if things need to be like adjusted, it can be a great way to do it, and it's even less costly than doing pair programming. So I would really recommend doing this kind of like midday meeting when you're joining a new team, and also because it's a great way to kind of like give you a goal, because in the morning you want to be ready to ask questions at this midday meeting, and then in the afternoon you want to deliver on what you agreed that you were going to do. So it's also a great way to keep yourself like motivated during the day. Next, it's about using breakpoints. So when I was working on this post, I asked the community how they like to explore a code base, and a lot of people mentioned using a symbolic breakpoint on viewDidLoad or viewDidAppear, which I found a pretty cool approach to learning more about the different views and view controllers that are used in a project. A symbolic breakpoint allows you to pause the execution of your program when a certain method is called on code you might not own. For example, you can have a symbolic breakpoint on UI view controller methods, which allows you to see whenever a new subclass of UI view controller is added to the navigation hierarchy. Knowing this kind of stuff is super useful because you'll be able to learn which view controllers belong to which screen quite quickly. I haven't used this one a lot myself, but I find it an interesting idea, so I wanted to include it in this list of tips. And additionally, like when debugging, it can be also extremely useful. I had talked on my channel of symbolic breakpoints because I had made a video that is actually like among the most watched of the channel, which is called like I think it's something like here's the ultimate tip to spot memory leaks, and it's about putting a symbolic breakpoint in the dialog of a view controller to play a little sound or write a message in the console when the view controller gets allocated. This way, like when you pop the navigation stack, if nothing happens, you know that your view controller is most probably leaking. So that's a great other way to use this this feature of Xcode, and I hadn't heard about it or thought about it, but now that I know about it, like if I need to debug a screen and I'm not sure which view controller is used, it can actually be a great way. Like what I used to do, what I'm used to doing is capture the view hierarchy and see which view controller is on screen, but it can be even like an easier way to do it. So great tip. I see a few new people in the chat. Hello Romain, hello Seri. I hope I've pronounced it correctly. And so we are reaching the end of the article. In summary, when you join a new team, it's tempting to keep your head down and study your new code base. In your head, you might think that you're expected to already know everything about the code base, even though you're completely new to the project. You might think that all patterns and practices in the project are industry standard and that you just haven't worked in places as good as this one before. All of these kinds of ideas exist in pretty much anybody's head, and they prevent you from properly learning and exploring a new code base. In this post, you have learned some tips about why human interaction is extremely important during your exploration phase. You also learned some useful tips for the more technical side of things to help you effectively tackle learning a new code base. Good luck on your next adventure into a new code base. And I can share the fact that indeed, especially maybe when you are like getting hired as a senior developer, maybe like being paid a good amount of money, you have this like either explicit or implicit pressure of delivering fast. But regardless of your level of expertise, a new code base will always require getting up to speed, because it is always a code base is at its core, a code base is a very complex assembly of small pieces. If it were to be a Lego, it would be a big Lego, like to say it that way. So when you see the number of lines of code in a code base, I mean, there is no shame in taking a bit of time to understanding a code base that could be millions of lines of code. Just imagine like if there is like something is leaking in your home, like the plumber needs to also like understand like the layout for all of the pipes. It's basically the same kind of analogy you could make. Like if you had like a million pipes, it would take like quite some time to find where the leak is, and even a good plumber would still need to spend some time like exploring all the pipes are being laid out. So that was for the third article. We still have two articles to go. For this next one, we are on the blog of Sarun. So up until now, there has almost always been one article from Sarun on every one of these live streams, but it's only fair because he really has like great content on his blog. So I always find something that I want to cover. Just like trying to moving myself a bit because I'm covering, yes, I was covering a bit like the content of the article. All right, this should be better. Let me just make the stream go fine. All right, and if I scroll, perfect, you can see the content. Perfect, let's get started. So this article, I wanted to cover it because it asks a question that even though you might have an idea, you might not be 100% sure about it. And the question is, does Swift enum retain its associated value? Actually, before we start reading the article, if you are watching live, maybe you can start and share what is your opinion. I'm going to share mine. I would say that yes, because in my mind, an associated value is just like a property. It's just a property that is like declared on a case of an enum rather than on the enum itself. But so I would say that yes, following this argument. And we can see this article is quite older. It's from like 2 years ago, but I guess Sarun must have shared it like recently because I remember seeing it on Twitter recently. So as an iOS developer, enum with associated values is one of my favorite language feature. It's also one of my favorite, and I actually released a video no later than 2 days ago that was about how you can use associated values to refactor code. And it is also a secret behind Optional, another language feature I love. So very true. Optional is implemented as an enum with an associated value, and you can check the code of Optional on the Swift standard library, which is open source and available on GitHub on the Swift repository. Actually, I did a live like a long time ago, but that's still available on the channel, where I go over several files in the Swift standard library, so you can go check it out after you're done with this one. I recently wonder which type of reference, strong and weak, does enum hold its associated values. So you can define Swift enumerations to store associated values of any given type, and the value types can be different for each case of the enumeration if needed. This is part of the documentation of Swift. I found on the Swift documentation that enumerations store the value, but it doesn't mention if it is weak or strong reference. So weak or strong. We can tell that enum holds a strong reference to its associated values based on the fact that Swift Optional implements using enum and can hold any object reference without releasing it. Here is an example use of Swift Optional. So we have a user which is an optional user, and it is set using the full optional syntax. So by saying we want the sum case of optional and pass as an associated value the user, and then if let user equal user, print it's alive. Okay. If the enum holds a weak reference, so I guess we assume that user is a class, a reference type, so either a class or an actor, but I guess it's a class. If the enum holds a weak reference, the user object will get released because nobody holds it except the optional enum. We won't see anything print in the debug console. If enum holds a strong reference, we will see it's alive print in the console. You should be able to guess the result without running it, since we use something like this all the time. And yes, it's alive will be printed, which confirms that enum retains its associated value. I like the way it's proven, because it's kind of like relying on the fact that kind of a transitive argument. Like since optional uses an associated value under the hood to store its value, then if optional retains its value, it means that associated values retain their value. That's a clever way to make the demonstration. Can we make a retain cycle with an enum? Can enum cause a retain cycle? This question was popping up after I realized that enum holds a strong reference to its associated value. It definitely should, but I want to be sure, so I make a little experiment. First, we create a login status enum. It contains two cases, guest and logged in, with user as an associated value. So enum login, case logged in with the user as an associated value, and case guest. Then we create a user class with a login status property. So we have a class user with a status property which is login status, initialized with guest at the beginning, and a dinit so that we can know whether the class has been removed from memory or not. So experiment 1, guest user. In this first example, I want to show that an object with no reference will be released. We create a local variable user in viewDidLoad, run the app, and you should see dinit user print in the debug console. No one holds or retains our user object, so it gets released after the method ended. The result dinit user printed in the console. That seems absolutely reasonable and expected. Experiment 2, logged in user. In this experiment, we want to create a retain cycle with enum. All the setups are the same as experiment 1, but this time we set user status to logged in and we pass the user as the associated value. This should create a retain cycle since the user holds a strong reference of status, and status also holds a strong reference back to user in the form of associated value in the enum, so the .logged in user case. So this code right here. Run the app and you shouldn't see any message in the debug console. The retain cycle has formed and our user object lives happily ever after in memory. So in conclusion, enum holds a strong reference to its associated value. Going to redo it. Enum holds a strong reference to its associated value is an obvious fact that I always overlook. I was never aware that I could cause retain cycle by using an enumeration. I would say it is not likely to happen in our day-to-day tasks, but you should be aware that it can happen. And indeed, so my initial answer, I'm glad that I had gotten the right one, but I was not 100% confident about it. But the argument I had that an associated value is basically just like a property, but at the level of a case of an enum instead of at the level of a type, kind of holds. And so where you can make a retain cycle using a property, you can also make a retain cycle using an associated value. So as the conclusion says, it shouldn't happen like that often, but if you ever, for instance, pass a closure to an associated value, then you could definitely if you pass a closure as an associated value for a case of an enum, then you could potentially create a retain cycle, for example. And we are reaching the last article of this live. We are on Antoine van der Lee's blog with one of his recent articles about optimizing your app for network reachability. So network reachability is a vital aspect of apps that use some networking capabilities. Your users won't always have a good internet connection, so optimizing your app for bad networking conditions is essential. We can leverage several techniques to optimize our app accordingly, but it's essential to be aware of common mistakes when you do. After writing several networking frameworks and tens of apps myself, it's time to share with you my best practices to prevent you from making mistakes I made in the past. So wait for connectivity instead of pre-checking for reachability. The most common mistake I see developers make is to pre-check for reachability before making a request. Apple's networking frameworks are optimized for a so-called wait for connectivity modal. If an active request encounters missing connectivity, it will wait and continue automatically when the connectivity restores. Your reachability check validates a moment in time and might not represent what's happening in the connection. Your user could be in an elevator for seconds, with their connection being restored soon. If your app decided to perform the request instead, it would benefit from a restored connection when the user exits the elevator. Instead, I recommend optimizing your networking layer for the wait for connectivity model. For example, you can configure timeouts on your URL session configuration. So you get the default configuration, and so wait for connectivity is set to true, timeout interval for request, so 1 minute, and timeout interval for resource, 1 hour. So let's see what each of these properties do. Depending on the type of the app, you can adjust these values to your needs. You might not want to wait more than 1 minute for a simple API request, but you expect more time for an upload request. The waits for connectivity boolean needs to be set to true and indicates whether the session should wait for connectivity to become available or fail immediately. So timeout interval for resource seems to be for uploads. That's interesting. And yeah, I guess you could even argue that 1 minute might be even like a bit too long. I've often seen like 30 seconds being used as the value, but it really depends on the context of the app also. Then it's about timeout interval for request versus timeout interval for resource. So great, we have a deep dive into the difference of the two. Both properties look similar, but have different purposes. Timeout interval for request is designed for regular tasks and controls how long in seconds a task should wait for additional data. Note that the associated timer for this timeout resets when new data arrives. In other words, on slow networking conditions, you'll still receive data and won't likely reach this timeout. So it's kind of like a deep bounce behavior. And then timeout interval for resource controls how long in seconds to wait for a complete resource to transfer before giving up. The default values is set to 7 days and might make you wonder. Regular API requests should never take so long. You're right, and with that, it should point you in the right direction. This timeout is designed for longer tasks like uploads and downloads that perform on a background URL session. Those sessions automatically retry failed tasks behind the scenes until the timeout interval for resource is reached. So like if you have like some uploading some backup, for instance, that could be like a large file, typically like a cloud storage app, then it could be really useful. If you're working with background URL sessions, you might want to read, so I guess it's a previous article, URL session, common pitfalls with backgrounds, download and upload tasks. And you know what? I'm going to add it to my reading list because it could be useful for a next session of this live. Let me check the chat. So Yamun, you are saying not to mention offline news. Indeed, also quite a big topic and very interesting to hear that from Antoine because Antoine works at WeTransfer and so he works on the WeTransfer app on iOS and it's definitely the kind of app where having to deal with sending large files across the network is part of the core use case. And Aman saying, well, I really enjoyed the format, getting the best of both worlds at one time. Great blogs plus your views. Thanks a lot. Well, I'm glad to hear that you are enjoying this format. And I'm trying something new also. I've made this series of live available as a podcast because now YouTube lets you like make videos available as a podcast. And since you can get most of the content even if you don't like see the videos, so it's also available as a podcast if you want to listen to it like during your daily commute. Next chapter is about restricting your app to Wi-Fi only. So similar to pre-checking network reachability, many apps pre-check the type of connectivity before performing any requests. A typical scenario is restricting networking to use Wi-Fi or Ethernet connections only. Instead, it's better to configure your networking layer to only allow certain types of connectivity. You can do this by adjusting your URL session configuration. So we have a property allows cellular access that we can set to false to only allow Wi-Fi or Ethernet. Ethernet being more likely on a Mac, I would say on Mac OS. Even though I'm sure that there is a USB-C to Ethernet adapter that exists, but I'm curious like whether you can use it on an iPhone, for instance. Like on an iPad, I guess you could. It would make sense, but can you use a USB-C to Ethernet adapter on an iPhone? Now I'm curious. I want to check it. Then we have allows expensive network access. So it prevents your app from using network interfaces that the system considers expensive. So I guess it could be like when you are like roaming, if you are like in a different country and you will be charged a ton for every megabyte that you are getting across the network. And finally, allows constrained network access. So indicates whether connections may use the network when the user has specified low data mode. Ah, that's interesting. So when you are in low data mode that you can enable in iOS, it's a setting that was added like a few years ago. It would be interesting if low battery or like energy economy mode. I'm not sure how you say it in English, but like the one that you enable to save like on the battery. I'm not sure of how it reflects in these properties. Maybe in the last one, but I'm not sure. And Yogesh, you're saying URL session configuration is also good for mockup, right? Could you give a bit more detail about what you mean? Like that, I understand it about like being able to like inject mocked responses to a request, but I'm not sure this is actually what you meant. Like, can you elaborate on this? And in the meantime, I'm going to resume the article. So you can change these properties anytime if you have a reference to your URL session configuration instance. By using these properties over network reachability checks, you allow Apple to perform optimizations for any outgoing network request. And always worth to mention that Apple and iOS probably know better about all of the fine details of optimizing for the network than a regular app developer does. So it's always a good idea to rely on what Apple has made for networking. Then responding to networking errors. Networking reachability checks are often made to tell users their app isn't working due to a lost connection. Without checking for reachability, you can still update your UI based on any return errors. I like to compare any errors to this list of codes. So NSURL error connection failure code, so an array of integers, a collection of error codes that relate to network connection failures. And so it seems we have like NSURL error background session in use by another process, cannot find host, cannot connect to host, network connection lost, not connected to internet, secure connection failed. So I guess it's all the potential errors that can happen when you try to connect to send a request across the network. Let me look at the chat. So Yogesh, you're saying, yes, I see one of the articles that we can do mockup API using URL protocol for unit test case, but I am not sure. Can you please make video on how to mockup API using URL protocol? I'm not a big expert on it, but I remember indeed that there were frameworks to do that. I remember working on an app that did that a few years ago. I think I think it was a library called OH HTTP stub, something like that. Made by Olivier Aligon, which is a French iOS developer that did a lot of cool open source projects like SwiftGen, for instance. But yeah, OH HTTP stub, I would recommend that you check it because it might be what you're looking for, or at least like it might be a good place to get started on what you're looking for. And yeah, Florent, I guess you were exactly referring to the same thing. So using URL protocol, but I must say I'm a little less knowledgeable on this. So I will do a nice screenshot of these comments so that I can maybe talk about it in a future video. So thanks for mentioning it because I didn't have the idea of potentially covering this topic. So not all the error codes relate to a missing internet connection, but they give me a reason to tell my users their connection isn't solid. you can make a convenience extension as follows. So extension on error and property is other connection error. And so if it's one of these errors in the array that was defined, then it says true. So is other connection error says true. And then you can update your UI based on the is other connection error property whenever one of your API requests returns an error to tell your users about an unstable connection. For example, in WeTransfer, we show the user a sheet explaining their connection is unstable. So we can see the WeTransfer app and we can see a sheet, so a model from the bottom of the screen that says you have a poor connection. That can be indeed a great way to let the user know that something is wrong and they might not be aware of it. Typically, we can see that there is Wi-Fi, so here airplane mode has been forced, but it could be things like you're in a hotel or on a public like Wi-Fi, and before you can make a request for your app, you first need to sign in into the network or just tick a box that says that you accept their condition, and until you haven't done so, you will still be on the Wi-Fi but not connected to the internet, and this can be tricky. Like some people even call this a Li-Fi, because you are on a Wi-Fi but you don't have access to the internet, and so it kind of as a user, the situation kind of lies a bit to you, and it can also lie to an app because the app can see okay, there is Wi-Fi, the device is connected to a Wi-Fi network, but internet is not working. And then when you should use networking reachability checks. At this point, you've tried your best to perform network requests, no matter the connection. You've received an error indicating an unstable networking environment, and you might want to retry the request automatically once the connection is restored. At this point, it's acceptable to start checking for a restored networking connection. The recommended way of doing this is by making use of the NW Path Monitor. So there used to be a snippet of code made by Apple to check for reachability. I think it was called reachability, hence the fact that the name has given some popularity. But now, yes, I have some. I remember using NW Path Monitor in a technical assignment back when I was looking for a new job, a year and a half ago. So we create a NW Path Monitor, and then on its path update handler, we switch on the status of the path, and if it's satisfied, then networking is restored, and otherwise, there's no connection available. And so the above code represents the most straightforward implementation of the monitor, but it comes with many more options, like checking for a restored cellular connection only. I encourage you to explore the API if you want more options. Testing your app for network connectivity. While implementing support for network reachability, creating a stable testing environment is essential. You can run your app on an actual device and switch between Wi-Fi, cellular, and airplane mode. But often you want to test on a simulator to accelerate your development workflow. Unfortunately, the only way to disable networking on the simulator is by turning off your max Wi-Fi. Doing so means you won't be able to use any other app or search for answers on Stack Overflow while debugging your implementation. Apple provides a network link conditioner that's also affecting your entire system's networking connectivity. I made the mistake during a training session over Zoom to enable the way to cut the network in the simulator, and it also cut, of course, my access to Zoom. And by the time I realized it, there were 1 or 2 minutes where I guess I had left all of the students alone. I had abandoned them, but it's a very easy mistake to make. And also when you're working Slack no longer sends you any notifications, so if you don't have your phone next to you also logged in, you can be like, whoa, it's a very calm afternoon, and then when you realize you get flooded by all the notifications you have missed, it can be both funny but also a little bit annoying. So disabling networking for your simulator app only. I decided to solve this problem by creating a network extension for RocketSim, which is Antoine's macOS app, which is an utility tool for the iOS simulator. After quite some network extension debugging on macOS, I managed to create an environment in which a specific simulator build would be blocked from networking. In the above example, you can see that I'm trying to create a new transfer. The request starts but fails immediately after it encounters a lost connection. After I confirmed the app was correctly responding with an update for the user, I restore the connection by disabling airplane mode. You can download RocketSim from the Mac App Store and try airplane mode for your app. And it's true that it's still not available, the airplane mode, on the simulator level on macOS, which is kind of a shame when you think about it. And so in conclusion, optimizing your app for network reachability starts by preventing common mistakes like pre-checking for reachability before performing a request. If there is one thing we should have learned from this article, is that you shouldn't check for network availability before you make a request. You should only check for it after the request has initially failed. Once you encounter a missing connection, you can check for a restored connection and resume requests accordingly. Using RocketSim, you're able to validate your implementation without affecting your max connection. I would still not disagree, but say that there might be some specific situations where checking before could make sense. I'm thinking it's rare cases, but it's like, for instance, if when the request has been sent, it stays like in limbo because there is no connection. If it is really like uncomfortable for the user, think about things like around like making a big bank transfer, things that are connected to stressful events. In that case, it might make sense to still check before this network call, just to avoid like having the UI be frozen maybe for like 30 seconds and you don't know what happened. I mean, frozen display loader, but still like the app wouldn't be usable maybe if it's at the end of like a flow of screens. So it can still be useful, I think, in some cases to pre-check for reachability, but not in all cases. And I think the article did like a great job of guiding towards like all of the up-to-date techniques to deal with a potential loss of connectivity on a user's device. And with that, I think we are done with this live. I mean, I'm saying we are done just like if it had been like some awful experience. It was a great experience. I'm actually like quite surprised because the previous one lasted for almost 2 hours and this one was just above 1 hour. So I don't know, like either I've gotten like faster or just like the articles were a bit shorter, which I think is definitely that one. But thank you for watching this live, whether you watched it live or using the replay. If you're still there, I can tell you a bit about what's coming in the coming weeks on the channel. So let me think. Next Tuesday, there will be a video with a new format that will be about tips that are valuable to use in your code. There won't be a live next week because I won't be available. However, there might be one the week after. I have the project of making, so I told you the live for the 10K followers where we watch my old videos, and also a live about iOS career advice, because I often get DMs from people asking me about career advice, and unfortunately I don't have the time to answer everyone. So I was thinking it could be pretty cool if I make just like a list of all these questions and I do a live and I answer them, like giving like just like my opinion about career advice question, like how to grow as an iOS developer, what kind of jobs are interesting, that kind of things. And finally, we will have WWDC soon, so I will try to make a recap video the day after the keynote and the State of the Union, and I will probably do a video like a live just like this one, covering blog articles written by the great people of the community, and this time focused on WWDC related topics. And I will also probably do content related to WWDC, but the actual content I will do will, as you can imagine, strongly depend on what will be announced at WWDC in something like 3 weeks now. It's getting closer and closer. So once again, thank you for watching this new installment of What's New in the iOS Community, my live newsletter. I also have a regular newsletter, and you can subscribe to it on my website, swiftwithvincent.com. And I guess I just have to say thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye bye.